kinds of hypothesis. Students, we need to know various kinds of hypothesis because in order to formulate an appropriate hypothesis, we need to know that what kinds of hypotheses are available to us and what is the nature of hypothesis we are going to give for a particular study, right? So if we just take a general view, hypothesis may be varying in its form and function, okay? But basically there are two types of hypotheses, right, at broader level, right? The major types of hypotheses are two: relational and causal. Relational, when we predict that there is a relation, okay, and that relation may be directional or may not be directional, like it may be non-directional, right, but there is a relation, okay. So that would be a relational hypothesis. And relational hypothesis simply means that one variable is related to another, right, and that the one construct or variable relates to others in one way or the other, in a positive manner or in a negative manner, right? So that is a relational hypothesis. And causal hypothesis is when we just predict that one variable causes changes in another one, right? So that is the causal relationship, the causal variable, okay? So these two basically two major types of these hypotheses are there: relational hypothesis and causal hypothesis. So let me just give you some views regarding these hypotheses, and then there are some other names which are given to some of the hypotheses. So we would just be using one term or one name or the other, but the focus would be on these two types of hypotheses. So one is the directional. When we are hypothesizing about a particular direction, right? So that is the relational hypothesis, which is directional. Like, for example, there is a relationship, there is a positive relationship between L1 reading skills and L2 reading skills, right? So this L1, which is mother tongue, and L2, which is the target language, when the reading skills of the both have positive relationship, right? Students who would read well in their L1 would also read well in L2. So that's the positive relationship, and the direction is there, okay? Then we may also have null hypothesis, which is non-directional hypothesis, which is also called non-directional hypothesis or zero hypothesis, right? Null hypothesis is zero hypothesis. So when we don't have any negative or positive direction, right, then it is a null hypothesis. And then we may also have some other names for hypotheses, like simple hypothesis or complex hypothesis. Simple when only two variables are there, independent and dependent, okay? And then we have complex hypothesis, like where more than two variables are involved, right, and the situation is complex. And we may also have alternative hypothesis. Alternative hypothesis is most of the time alternative to the null hypothesis, right? And then we have statistical hypothesis, the term statistical hypothesis, which is at times given to null hypothesis, right? And then logical hypothesis, and there are some other terms like declarative hypothesis. When we are declaring a situation, we are hypothesizing in a declarative manner. Or there is another rarely used type of hypothesis, which is called the question hypothesis, where the hypothesis is given in a question form, right? And this type of hypothesis is very rare, but that is also one possibility, okay? So the point is that the null hypothesis, which is non-directional, as already discussed, or zero hypothesis, it is basically an assertion that there is no relationship existing between the two factors or two variables, right? So that is null hypothesis, okay? And null hypothesis is always the basis for, particularly for statistical, tests which are used in research. Like, for example, we may be using SPSS, the Statistical Package for Social Sciences, which is, in very simple terms, which is an advanced version of Excel sheet, sort of thing, right? So that is the basis for such a study, statistical study, is the null hypothesis, right? And the null hypothesis, since it is testable, okay, so that's why it is called statistical hypothesis as well. And it is selected in the framework of probability, right, sampling, maybe probability paradigm design for the research, right? So null hypothesis is taken in that paradigm, and null hypothesis is most of the time used in educational researches, right? Particularly in psychology, right? Like we are working with motivation, or we are working with anxiety, or in order to just verify or investigate the cognitive abilities of students, right? So where psychology, particularly in ELT and other areas of linguistics like applied linguistics, or interdisciplinary study like psycholinguistics, when psychology and language both are involved, or sociolinguistics. So in such studies we need to go for this null hypothesis, okay? And null hypothesis is evaluated in terms of significance, that whether there is a significant relationship or not. So there is a level of significance determined by various statistical tests. So that would be the more appropriate way to verify a null hypothesis, right? And that significance may be accepted or may be rejected. So the null hypothesis may be proved, or it may be the case otherwise, okay? So that is the case of null hypothesis. Then we have directional hypothesis, when we just want to hypothesize about an expected direction, that whether the direction is going to be in a positive manner or in a negative manner, right? So that would be the directional hypothesis. And when specific direction is given, like the earlier example which we discussed, that there is a positive relationship between L1 reading skills and L2 reading skills, right? So in this case there is a positive relationship, and that's the direction which is given in this hypothesis. So that may be termed as directional hypothesis. Then we have declarative hypothesis, when the anticipated relationship is given when it is hypothesized in a declarative manner, okay? And the existing evidence is examined, right? So that is one type of declarative hypothesis. And the last to discuss here is the question hypothesis. There is not enough consensus among the experts who would consider a question in the form of hypothesis, but there are some studies, very few studies, where such a possibility is found, right? When a question is used as a hypothesis, right? So that is also one possibility, and this is called the simplest level of empirical evidence, right? When a very straightforward, very simple level of empirical evidence is verified, or it is questioned, right? So question may or may not qualify as a hypothesis. That's another discussion, but the point is that these are the major types of hypotheses which must be known to students or scholars who want to proceed with their research studies.